Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The village of Bramblewick prided itself on its sameness. It was the sort of place where the hedges were clipped to identical heights, where the church bells rang with comforting punctuality, and where nothing of consequence ever seemed to occur without first being discussed, quietly, thoroughly, and often inaccurately, over teacups. That was why the garden party at Rosebank House caused such pleasant excitement. Events, after all, were rare, tragedies unthinkable. Rosebank belonged to Mr. Lionel Harcourt, a man who had returned to the village 3 years earlier with money, manners, and an air of vague superiority that suggested success elsewhere. He was charming in the practiced way of someone who knew exactly when to smile and how long to hold a handshake. His parties were known for their abundance: cucumber sandwiches cut thin as pages, strawberries piled with theatrical generosity, and champagne poured just freely enough to make people feel chosen. Miss Jane Marple arrived precisely at 4 o'clock. She wore her usual pale cardigan and sensible shoes, her white hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat trimmed with faded blue ribbon. To the casual observer, she appeared exactly what she was expected to be, an elderly spinster, fond of knitting and village gossip, invited out of politeness rather than anticipation. Several guests smiled at her with vague kindness before promptly forgetting she was there. Miss Marple noticed everything. She noted, for instance, that Mrs. Edith Bell, the vicar's wife, had brought a store-bought sponge cake, despite the clear implication that all offerings were to be homemade. She noticed that young Peter Rowlands lingered near the drinks table far longer than was appropriate for a man who claimed not to like champagne. She observed, too, that Mr. Harcourt himself laughed a shade too loudly and glanced at his watch more often than a relaxed host ought. The garden was at its most deceptive. Late summer roses bloomed extravagantly along the trellis, bees hummed with industrious contentment, and the lawn, croquet ready and flawless, invited a sense of peace that settled easily into the bones. Folding chairs were scattered in conversational clusters. The village orchestra, reduced to 3 earnest amateurs, played something light and unchallenging. "Such a perfect evening," murmured Mrs. Bell, lowering herself beside Miss Marple. "One almost forgets how dreadful the world can be." Miss Marple smiled and nodded, folding her hands over her handbag. "Yes," she said mildly, "one almost does." At 4:30, Mr. Harcourt excused himself. He did so with charm, apologizing for a quick matter indoors, and disappeared into Rosebank House, leaving his guests comfortably distracted by fresh trays of sandwiches and the arrival of a second bottle of champagne. No one thought it odd. Hosts, after all, had responsibilities. At 5:15 the scream came. It was sharp, high, and unmistakably human. It cut through laughter and music alike, silencing the garden in a single collective breath. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped a teacup. It shattered like punctuation. The scream came again, this time closer, from inside the house. Miss Marple rose to her feet. She did so calmly, adjusting her cardigan as if preparing to leave a perfectly ordinary gathering. Around her, people were already moving, some rushing toward the house, others hesitating, torn between curiosity and fear. They found Mr. Harcourt in the study. He lay sprawled near the writing desk, one arm twisted unnaturally beneath him, his expression frozen in something between surprise and protest. The open window admitted a cool breeze that stirred the papers on the desk, though nothing else in the room appeared disturbed. No sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, just the body. Someone began to sob. Someone else whispered, "Is he—" The doctor, summoned in a flurry of panic, would later confirm what Miss Marple already suspected from the stillness of him. Lionel Harcourt was very much dead. As the villagers crowded the doorway, faces pale, Eyes bright with fear and fascination, Miss Marple stood slightly apart. She did not gasp, she did not speak. Her gaze moved quietly from the body to the desk, to the window, to the faces of those present. People always believed that shock revealed nothing. Miss Marple knew better. Shock revealed everything. The news moved through Bramblewick with astonishing speed, as though the scream itself had scattered fragments that lodged in every open window and hedgerow. By 6 o'clock, the garden party had dissolved into clusters of murmuring villagers, coats hastily retrieved, faces tight with excitement that pretended to be concern. The police were called, of course, and the vicar rang the bishop with trembling hands, but neither action slowed the immediate spread of speculation. By the time the first constable arrived, 3 separate theories had already achieved the status of certainty, each supported by someone who knew for a fact how such things happened. Mrs. Edith Bell took charge of sorrow with the brisk authority she applied to church fats. She ushered the more delicate ladies into the drawing-room, pressing tea into their hands while whispering that poor Mr. Harcourt had always been a little too secretive for his own good. The word secretive floated from mouth to mouth, gathering implication as it went. Someone recalled that he had once missed evensong without explanation. Another remembered seeing a stranger's car parked near Rosebank late one evening. These details, formerly insignificant, were now polished into evidence. Outside, near the gravel drive, the men spoke in lower voices but with equal confidence. Colonel Watkins, retired and perpetually disappointed by peacetime, announced that the whole thing bore the marks of continental business, by which he meant foreign intrigue of a conveniently vague sort. Mr. Dennis Pike, the estate agent, suggested robbery, though nothing appeared to be missing, and no one could quite say what a man like Harcourt kept worth stealing. Still, robbery had a satisfying neatness. It allowed one to believe that danger arrived from elsewhere and departed just as quickly. Young Peter Rowlands hovered between groups, eager and pale. He told anyone who would listen that he had been near the house just before the scream and had seen nothing at all, which he repeated so often that several people began to wonder why. His account grew more detailed with each telling, until he could describe precisely how empty the hallway had been, how quiet, how impossible it was that someone could have slipped past him. This insistence earned nods at first, then raised eyebrows. Innocents, Miss Marple knew, rarely protested so loudly. The women, meanwhile, were kinder but no less imaginative. Mrs. Clark whispered to Mrs. Jennings that Mr. Harcourt had quarrelled with his housekeeper only the week before. Mrs. Jennings added that the housekeeper had a look about her, though she could not specify what look that might be. Someone else recalled that Mr. Harcourt had once been engaged, years ago, to a woman who vanished abruptly. Vanished people, it was generally agreed, had a habit of returning at inconvenient moments. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner of the drawing-room, her hands folded, her expression one of mild distress. She listened as voices rose and fell, noting not only what was said but how. She observed which names were spoken readily and which caused a pause, however brief. She noticed that when Mrs. Bell mentioned the housekeeper, 2 women exchanged a glance and then looked away. She saw that when Peter Rowlands spoke, Mr. Pike watched him with narrowed eyes, as though recalculating a valuation that no longer quite added up. What struck her most was not the eagerness to explain the crime, but the relief with which explanations were offered. Each theory allowed its speaker to step back into safety, to draw a firm line between themselves and the body upstairs. Guilt was always assigned outward, to strangers, to servants, to the dead man's past. No one suggested that the answer might lie closer, among the familiar faces and well-practiced smiles of Bramblewick itself. When the police finally asserted control, requesting that no one leave until statements were taken, the mood shifted subtly. Voices lowered, jokes fell flat. People began, for the first time, to think not about what had happened, but about what they themselves had done that afternoon, where they had stood, whom they had spoken to, how long they had been absent. Memory, so inventive a moment before, became suddenly cautious. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea she did not drink, and watched this change with gentle interest. It reminded her of a village sale years earlier, when a small sum of money went missing and everyone, quite unconsciously, began checking their own purses. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. Given time, Bramblewick would settle on a culprit it found comfortable, someone whose guilt made sense and demanded little further thought. The danger lay in that comfort. Upstairs, behind a closed door, Lionel Harcourt lay exactly where he had fallen, beyond gossip and theory alike. Downstairs, among the murmurs and the clink of teacups, the village was already busy arranging the story of his death. Miss Marple, unobtrusive and nearly forgotten, listened on, knitting nothing at all, and waiting for the moment when someone, inevitably, would say just a little too much. By the following morning, Bramblewick had acquired the air of a village temporarily pretending to be something else. Curtains twitched with greater frequency, doors opened a fraction more cautiously, and conversations stopped with unnatural neatness whenever footsteps approached. The presence of the police, modest though it was, lent a seriousness that the villagers both resented and enjoyed. Tragedy, after all, was more palatable when supervised. Miss Marple walked down the high street shortly after 10, her pace unhurried, her handbag resting against her wrist. She had declined Mrs. Bell's invitation to sit quietly at home, explaining that fresh air was good for the nerves. This was accepted with indulgent smiles. No one imagined that Miss Marple's nerves required calming, nor that she might be interested in anything beyond the comfort of routine. At the post office, she paused to buy stamps she did not need. The girl behind the counter, usually reticent, leaned forward eagerly. "Such a dreadful business," she said, lowering her voice, although there was no one else present. "My aunt says the police are asking about everyone who went into the house." "Yes," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "That would be sensible. They'll find out soon enough," the girl went on. "Things like that don't happen without a reason." Miss Marple agreed, collected her stamps and moved on. She encountered Peter Rowlands near the baker's, his hands thrust deep into his pockets despite the mild weather. He looked as though he had not slept well. When he saw Miss Marple, he flushed and nodded too quickly. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Peter," she said kindly. "Such a shock for everyone, isn't it?" Yes, terrible," he hesitated. "I told the police everything, of course." "I'm sure you did," Miss Marple said. "It must be tiring, repeating it all." He laughed nervously, as though uncertain whether this was sympathy or accusation, and made an excuse about errands before hurrying away. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the slight stiffness of his shoulders, the way his gaze flicked left and right as though measuring distances. At Rosebank House the gates were closed, but the house itself felt oddly exposed. Windows that once reflected roses and sky now seemed to stare back blankly. Miss Marple did not attempt to enter. Instead, she lingered at the edge of the drive, examining the flower beds with apparent interest. A constable glanced at her, dismissed her as harmless, and returned to his conversation. From this vantage, Miss Marple could see the study windows still open. She frowned faintly. Windows, she reflected, were very often left open by people who expected to return shortly, or by those who wished to suggest someone else had come and gone. Later, she accepted an invitation to lunch from Mrs. Clark, whose house offered an excellent view of Rosebank from an upstairs window. Mrs. Clark was flattered and talkative, providing both soup and opinion in generous measure. "I always thought there was something odd about him," Mrs. Clark said, stirring her tea. "Not bad, you understand, just not quite fitting. No one ever quite fits everywhere," Miss Marple replied. "Well, perhaps not," Mrs. Clark conceded, "but he kept things to himself, papers, letters. I once saw him burn a whole bundle in the garden." "Did you?" Miss Marple said mildly. That must have been dramatic." "Oh, terribly," Mrs. Clark said, pleased. "I remember thinking it looked like a farewell of some kind." Miss Marple asked no further questions, but she stored the image away. Throughout the afternoon she repeated this gentle pattern. She listened to the housekeeper, who spoke of her employer with a loyalty edged by long familiarity. She spoke to Colonel Watkins, who outlined his theory again, more firmly now that it had been repeated to the police. She heard Mrs. Bell express sorrow that was tinged just faintly with triumph at being centrally involved in such a significant event. What interested Miss Marple was not contradiction but consistency. Certain phrases appeared again and again, passed along like heirlooms. No sign of a struggle. He'd gone inside alone. Anyone could have done it. These were comforting thoughts, designed to spread responsibility thinly enough that no one had to carry it. Yet there were omissions as well. No one mentioned the brief argument Miss Marple had overheard near the roses, just before Mr. Harcourt excused himself. No one spoke of the way one guest had watched him go, their smile lingering a fraction too long. By evening, the police had formed a preliminary opinion. It centered, as such opinions often did, on the most visible unease. Peter Rowlands had been questioned twice more, his alibi examined with professional interest. The housekeeper, too, remained under scrutiny, though more out of habit than conviction. Miss Marple sat by her window as dusk settled, knitting at last, though she frequently forgot to count. She was not disappointed by the direction of the investigation. Obvious suspects served a purpose. They allowed the truth to grow impatient. She thought again of the open window, of burned papers, of practiced charm and imperfect smiles. She thought of how rarely crimes were committed by strangers, and how often by people who believed themselves unseen. Somewhere in Bramblewick someone was listening just as carefully as she was, waiting to learn what the village believed. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she smiled to herself. It would not be long, she thought, before belief and truth began, inevitably, to drift apart. The police presence became more defined on the third day, settling into the village like an unfamiliar piece of furniture everyone had to walk around. Inspector Dunning arrived from the county office shortly after breakfast, bringing with him a seriousness that differed from the constable's polite diligence. He was a methodical man, fond of clear timelines and firmer conclusions, and Bramblewick responded to him with a mixture of deference and quiet resistance. Miss Marple observed his arrival from her sitting-room window. She noted the way he paused before entering Rosebank House, studying the front door as though expecting it to offer an explanation. She approved of that. Doors, like people, often said more when approached carefully. By mid-morning it was clear that the investigation had found its shape. Peter Rowlands was spoken of openly now, his name no longer lowered in cautious sympathy, but lifted into the light of possibility. He had been near the house. He had no convincing reason to be there. He had grown visibly agitated during questioning. These facts, assembled neatly, formed a picture the inspector found agreeable. Mrs. Bell wasted no time in repeating this consensus to Miss Marple over tea. "Such a pity," she said, shaking her head with solemn relish. "He always seemed such a nice young man, but nerves will tell, won't they, especially if one has something to hide?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "They do tell, though not always the story we expect." Inspector Dunning himself called on Miss Marple that afternoon, having been advised, by Mrs. Bell naturally, that she had been present throughout the party and possessed a clear memory. He regarded her with polite skepticism, the kind reserved for elderly witnesses who meant well but wandered. "You were in the garden most of the time, Miss Marple?" he asked. "Yes, Inspector. Gardens are so pleasant, don't you think? And you didn't see anyone follow Mr. Harcourt into the house?" "I did not see anyone follow him," she replied carefully. "But you did see him leave the party?" "Oh yes, quite clearly." The inspector nodded, satisfied. Then you'd agree it's likely someone already near the house took advantage of the opportunity. Likely things are often misleading, Miss Marple said mildly, but I'm sure you know that. He smiled, indulgent, and thanked her for her time. As he left, Miss Marple reflected that Peter Rowlands did indeed look like a young man capable of panic. She had known many such boys, earnest, eager to please, and terrified of disapproval. They made excellent suspects and dreadful criminals. Fear, she had observed, was far more often the result of accusation than the cause of guilt. The village, however, found comfort in the narrowing focus. Conversations regained a sense of order. Speculation grew bolder, names attached to motives with increasing confidence. Mr. Pike remarked that Peter had always seemed ambitious. Mrs. Clark recalled that Mr. Harcourt had once refused him a loan. Even the girl at the post office spoke of that sort of look returning to his face. Miss Marple listened and said nothing. That evening she took a short walk past Rosebank House. The constable on duty nodded at her, recognizing her now as a harmless fixture. The study window had finally been closed, but the curtains remained open, revealing the desk where Mr. Harcourt had died. The room looked smaller without him, diminished, as though its authority had depended entirely on his presence. As Miss Marple turned away, she nearly collided with Mrs. Jennings, who grasped her arm with sudden intensity. "It's dreadful, isn't it?" Mrs. Jennings said, "but at least they're getting somewhere now." "Are they?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Well, everyone knows who it must be," Mrs. Jennings said, lowering her voice. "I shouldn't be surprised if it's all settled very soon." Miss Marple smiled. "That would be tidy." "Yes," Mrs. Jennings agreed. "And after all, these things don't usually involve people like us." Miss Marple watched her go, the words echoing gently. "People like us." She had heard that phrase many times, always spoken with confidence, always proven wrong. Later that night she sat by her fire and reviewed the day's impressions. Peter's fear was genuine, but fear was not guilt. The inspector's theory required simplicity, but simplicity rarely accounted for the careful arrangements people made when they believed themselves clever. She thought again of Mr. Harcourt's charm, so polished it had become impersonal. She thought of the burned papers, the argument overheard, the eyes that had followed him indoors, and she thought, most of all, of how quickly the village had agreed. Agreement, Miss Marple knew, was dangerous. It discouraged listening. Somewhere the true culprit was experiencing a quieter emotion than fear, relief perhaps, or satisfaction, or the calm assurance of someone who believed the story was unfolding exactly as planned. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting and smiled faintly. The police might be eager to close the case, and Bramblewick more eager still to see it done. But human nature, she reflected, had a habit of leaving small imperfections behind, and it was often those imperfections, barely noticed, easily dismissed, that told the truest story of all. The first real crack appeared in a place no one thought to examine closely, which was precisely why it mattered. It came to Miss Marple's attention during a quiet afternoon visit from the housekeeper, Mrs. Allen, who arrived with folded hands and an expression of anxious propriety. She had come, she said, because she could not bear the thought that people might misunderstand her employer's habits, and because Miss Marple, she had heard, was someone who noticed things.
"That's kind of you to say," Miss Marple replied, offering her a chair. "Please sit down. You look tired."
Mrs. Allen sat, smoothing her skirt. "It's all been such a strain. The police keep asking about the study, about papers, letters." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "There were many papers, weren't there?" Mrs. Allen nodded. "Too many, really. Mr. Harcourt disliked clutter, but he kept things. Old things. He said one never knew when the past might be useful." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. "Did he often burn papers?" Mrs. Allen hesitated. "Not often, only once that I recall. He was quite agitated that day." "And when was that?" About a fortnight before the party." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Did he say why?" "No. But he was expecting someone. He dressed carefully that afternoon. After Mrs. Allen left, Miss Marple sat very still. The village had decided that Mr. Harcourt went into the house alone for some trivial reason. Yet expectation changed things. People expecting company behaved differently. They prepared. They rehearsed. And they were rarely surprised when the door opened. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Bell, who was in a state of busy agitation over parish matters that suddenly seemed very important indeed. Miss Marple listened dutifully until the conversation drifted, as it always did, back to Rosebank. "It's all so dreadful," Mrs. Bell said, "though I must say Inspector Dunning seems confident." "Confidence is comforting," Miss Marple agreed. "May I ask, did you notice anything unusual just before Mr. Harcourt went inside?" Mrs. Bell frowned. "Unusual? No, I don't think so. He was laughing, perfectly normal." "Did anyone speak to him at that moment?" "Well, yes. Mrs. Jennings, I believe. She wanted to know about the donation he promised the church." "And did he seem pleased?" Mrs. Bell considered. "Not particularly. He excused himself rather quickly, now that I think of it." Miss Marple thanked her and took her leave. The detail was small, almost negligible. A question about money, a swift retreat indoors. Yet Miss Marple felt the familiar sensation of a pattern beginning to suggest itself, like threads aligning before the eye consciously recognized the shape. That evening, she attended a modest supper at Mrs. Clark's, where several villagers gathered under the pretense of mutual comfort. Conversation was subdued but persistent. Peter Rowland's name surfaced again and again, spoken now with a certainty that bordered on irritation, as though his failure to confess were a personal inconvenience. "He looks so guilty," Mrs. Clark said, "always fidgeting." "Some people fidget when frightened," Miss Marple remarked. "Others become very calm." There was a brief pause. Mrs. Jennings laughed lightly. "Well, I'm sure we're all glad we're not in his position." Miss Marple glanced at her. Mrs. Jennings sat very straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not fidget at all. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple excused herself early. On her walk home she passed Rosebank once more. Lights glowed in the lower rooms where officers continued their work. The house seemed less like a home now and more like a shell, emptied of its authority, revealing the ordinary fragility beneath. Miss Marple paused by the hedge where she had stood during the party. From here she could recall precisely how the scene had unfolded, the laughter, the music, Mr. Harcourt's practiced smile, and then the momentary tension, a raised voice, not loud enough to attract attention but sharp enough to register. She had dismissed it at the time as nothing more than impatience. Now she reconsidered. Voices carried differently outdoors. Words meant to be private often assumed they were unheard. The next morning brought another small revelation. Miss Marple received a note from Mr. Pike, inviting her to call on him regarding a matter that might be relevant. She went, curious. "I've been thinking," he said, pacing his office, "about the donation Harcourt promised the village fund. It never arrived." "No," Miss Marple said, "I don't believe it did. He told several people it was settled," Mr. Pike went on. "But when I asked him directly last month, he said circumstances had changed." "And did he say why?" Mr. Pike shook his head. "Only that someone had reminded him of an old obligation." Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle. An obligation, burned papers, an expected visitor, a question about money moments before his death. She thanked Mr. Pike and walked home slowly, arranging her thoughts with care. The clue was not a single fact, but the absence of something everyone assumed, surprise. Nothing about Mr. Harcourt's final moments suggested shock at being confronted. No overturned chair, no struggle, only a sudden end, which meant, Miss Marple thought, that when death came, it arrived wearing a familiar face. And somewhere in Bramblewick, someone knew that too. By the 6th day after the murder, Bramblewick had begun to tire of its own certainty. The thrill of agreement dulled once it demanded patience, and patience was never the village's strongest virtue. Inspector Dunning's inquiries continued, but without the satisfying progress people had expected. Peter Rowlands remained under suspicion, yet no decisive evidence appeared, and his repeated interviews produced nothing new beyond exhaustion and visible misery. Miss Marple noticed the shift immediately. Conversations grew sharper, less generous. People no longer spoke with excitement but with irritation, as though the case itself had failed to behave properly. When certainty faltered, tempers followed. She encountered Peter one afternoon near the churchyard. He was sitting on a low stone wall, staring at the ground with a bleak concentration that made him seem much younger than his years. "They think I did it," he said abruptly, without looking up. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, sitting beside him. "They do. I wouldn't," he said. "I couldn't. No," she agreed gently. He turned to her then, desperation breaking through his restraint. "Why won't they believe me?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because believing you would require them to start again. And starting again is very uncomfortable." Peter laughed bitterly. "So I'm easier." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "you are." She left him there, knowing comfort would not help him, and that truth rarely arrived wrapped in kindness. As she walked on, she reflected that Peter's misery was genuine, and genuine misery had a way of spreading unease. Innocent people under pressure unsettled the neat stories others preferred. That unease surfaced later that evening at Mrs. Bell's, where a small gathering assembled to discuss parish repairs, but lingered, inevitably, on darker matters. Inspector Dunning himself attended briefly, offering polite reassurance that the investigation was proceeding as expected. The phrase pleased no one. Mrs. Jennings, however, appeared unusually animated. She spoke at length about the importance of trust in a community, about how dreadful it was when suspicion lingered unnecessarily. Her tone was bright, almost insistent, and Miss Marple noticed that she spoke more than usual, filling every pause with words. "It's terrible for the village," Mrs. Jennings said. "This atmosphere, we need closure." "Closure," Miss Marple echoed softly. "Yes, that is very important." Mrs. Jennings smiled tightly. "Exactly." Lingering doubts helped no one. Later, as Miss Marple stood near the window, she overheard Mrs. Jennings speaking to Inspector Dunning in lowered tones. "You must see," she was saying, "that drawing this out only causes harm. People are frightened." The inspector replied in measured terms, but his patience was thinning. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Jennings, but I don't arrest people to reassure villages." Miss Marple turned away quietly, but she had heard enough. The following morning brought another disturbance, smaller than the first, but no less revealing. Mrs. Allen arrived at Miss Marple's door in tears. Someone, she said, had gone through her room at Rosebank.
Nothing was missing, but drawers had been disturbed.
"They said it must be the police," Mrs. Allen said. "But it didn't feel official." "No," Miss Marple said, "it wouldn't. Why would anyone do that?" Miss Marple poured her tea.
To make sure something wasn't there.
Mrs. Allen frowned. "But what?" "That," Miss Marple replied, "depends on what they feared." After Mrs. Allen left, Miss Marple sat quietly considering. Searching a servant's room suggested anxiety, not confidence. Someone believed a mistake might still surface, and was trying to stay ahead of it. That was not the behavior of a person certain the story was finished. Later that day, Miss Marple took a longer walk than usual, stopping briefly at the edge of Rosebank's garden. The roses were beginning to fade now, petals dropping untidily onto the lawn. She remembered how carefully arranged they had looked during the party, how deliberately pleasant everything had been. Pleasantness, she reflected, was often a disguise. She recalled again the moment before Mr. Harcourt went indoors, the question about money, the irritation, the abrupt withdrawal. If he had been confronted with something threatening, he might have reacted differently, anger perhaps, or alarm. Instead, he had gone inside as one might when resigned to an unpleasant but familiar conversation. That evening, Inspector Dunning called on Miss Marple once more. This time his manner was more serious. "You've been very observant," he said. "People speak freely around you." "They often do," Miss Marple agreed. "They forget I'm listening." He hesitated. "Do you have anything you'd like to share?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "Only an impression. I'm listening." "The wrong person is frightened," she said gently. The inspector frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning that the person everyone suspects is afraid because he's being accused. The person who should be afraid is not." Inspector Dunning exhaled slowly. "That's not much to go on." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But it is a beginning." After he left, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had not named anyone. Naming too soon warned people. What she wanted now was observation under pressure. The pressure, she knew, would increase naturally. Doubt was spreading. Certainty was unraveling. Someone who believed themselves safe would soon feel the need to reinforce that safety. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting steadily. She thought of Mrs. Jennings' insistence on closure, of the search through Mrs. Allen's belongings, of the calm that masked urgency. She thought, too, of how often those who committed desperate acts believed themselves justified, even virtuous. Somewhere nearby, someone was adjusting their behavior, smoothing edges and correcting small oversights. They would speak a little more or a little less. They would watch reactions too carefully. Miss Marple smiled faintly as her needles clicked. Human nature, she reflected, was never still for long. Under scrutiny, it shifted. And when it did, it almost always revealed the truth to anyone patient enough to notice the change. The shift came quietly, as such things usually did, and might have gone unnoticed had Miss Marple not been expecting it. It began with a change in tone. Mrs. Jennings, once so eager to speak of closure and village harmony, grew suddenly circumspect. She still attended gatherings, still smiled and offered sympathy, but she listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, her words were measured, carefully neutral, as though she were walking across ground she had only just realized was unstable. Miss Marple observed this one afternoon at the vicarage, where tea was served to a small group under the pretext of planning a memorial service. Mrs. Jennings arrived precisely on time, her attire impeccable, her manner calm. Too calm, Miss Marple thought, for someone who had previously been so invested in the emotional temperature of the village. When Peter Rowland's name arose, mentioned by Colonel Watkins with a dismissive shrug, Mrs. Jennings did not join in. Instead, she sipped her tea and gazed thoughtfully at the window. "A sad business," she said at last. "One hopes the truth comes out, whatever it may be." The phrase was harmless enough, but Miss Marple noted the emphasis on whatever. Later that same day, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Pike outside his office. He looked unsettled, his usual briskness dulled by indecision. "I may be mistaken," he said, lowering his voice, "but I think someone's been asking rather pointed questions about old property records, not the police." "Old records can be very interesting," Miss Marple replied, "especially when people wish they were forgotten." "Yes," Mr. Pike said slowly, "that's just it." Miss Marple did not ask who had been inquiring. She already suspected. People rarely investigated the past unless it threatened the present. The following evening brought the first true disturbance since the murder. Mrs. Allen was found in a state of agitation in the Rosebank kitchen, having discovered a loose floorboard beneath the pantry rug. Beneath it lay nothing more than dust and a rusted key, but the discovery caused a flurry of alarm. Inspector Dunning examined the spot himself. "It looks old," he said, Probably nothing to do with the case. Probably, Miss Marple echoed softly. The key was dismissed, tagged and set aside, but the incident had its effect. It reminded everyone that Rosebank still held secrets, and that some of them might not be as thoroughly destroyed as Mr. Harcourt had believed. Miss Marple paid another visit to Mrs. Allen the next day, ostensibly to offer comfort. The housekeeper was pale and tired, her composure strained. "He was afraid near the end," Mrs. Allen said suddenly. "Mr. Harcourt, I mean." "Afraid of what?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Of being exposed," Mrs. Allen said. "He said the village had long memories." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, they do." "What I don't understand," Mrs. Allen went on, "is why he seemed almost relieved that day. Upset, yes, but also resolved, as though he'd accepted something." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Acceptance can be dangerous. That evening Miss Marple made her decision. She called on Mrs. Jennings the following afternoon, bringing with her a plate of seed cake and an air of mild confusion. "I wonder if you could help me," Miss Marple said. "I've been thinking about something Mr. Harcourt once said to me." Mrs. Jennings stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Did he?" "Oh, yes. About obligations, how they linger even when one believes them settled." Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "It's probably nothing, but I thought you might know what he meant." Mrs. Jennings set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Obligations can mean many things," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Money, promises, silence." There was a pause. Mrs. Jennings' smile did not falter, but it lost its warmth. "You're very observant, Miss Marple," she said. "Oh, not really," Miss Marple replied. "I just remember people." The silence stretched. Mrs. Jennings stood abruptly and crossed the room, adjusting the curtains, although they needed no adjustment at all. "You know," she said lightly, her back turned, "it's dreadful how rumors grow. One hardly recognizes the truth once people have finished with it." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "That is why I prefer small truths," she said. "They're harder to lose." When Miss Marple left, she was satisfied, not because she had confirmed anything beyond doubt, but because she had seen fear, real fear, flicker where confidence had once been. That night, Inspector Dunning received an anonymous note requesting a meeting at Rosebank, claiming new information about the donation Mr. Harcourt had promised and never delivered. The handwriting was neat, cautious, and entirely unhelpful. Miss Marple heard of it the next morning and smiled to herself. Someone, she thought, was trying to steer the investigation, to redirect attention, to control the ending. Control was always the giveaway. People who acted in passion left chaos behind. People who acted out of calculation tried to tidy it afterward. As the village prepared for the memorial service, Miss Marple prepared for something else entirely. She had seen enough now to attempt her final test. Not a confrontation, those were vulgar, but a quiet arrangement of circumstances that would invite truth to step forward of its own accord. Human nature, she reflected, hated uncertainty. When pressed gently but persistently, it would reveal itself just to restore a sense of balance. And soon, very soon, someone in Bramblewick would realize that the story they had been telling themselves was no longer holding together at all. The memorial service for Lionel Harcourt was held on a grey afternoon that seemed undecided about rain. The church filled more completely than it had for years, not solely out of respect, but from a collective sense that attendance mattered. Appearances, in Bramblewick, were a form of participation. Miss Marple took her usual place near the aisle, close enough to observe without being observed herself. Inspector Dunning was present, seated near the front, his expression appropriately solemn. Bell moved about with quiet efficiency, guiding people to seats, smoothing sleeves, whispering reassurances. Mrs. Jennings arrived just as the organ began to play, her face composed, her black gloves buttoned with care. She caught Miss Marple's eye for a brief moment and smiled, though the smile did not reach her eyes. The service passed without incident, but Miss Marple was less interested in the words spoken from the pulpit than in the small movements of the congregation. She noticed how often Mrs. Jennings glanced toward the side door. She noticed how Mr. Pike watched the inspector rather than the vicar. She noticed, too, how Peter Rowland sat rigidly, hands clenched, as though afraid that even shifting his weight might draw attention. Afterward, as people gathered in the churchyard, Inspector Dunning lingered, speaking quietly with several parishioners. Miss Marple waited. Patience, she knew, was a virtue not because it was difficult, but because it was effective. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. Mrs. Jennings approached her, her tone light, almost relieved. "I'm so glad that's over," she said. "These things can be terribly draining." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They do tend to bring matters to a head." Mrs. Jennings laughed softly. "You always have such interesting turns of phrase." Miss Marple smiled. "I've lived a long time." There was a pause, filled by the sound of gravel crunching under departing feet. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer. "I heard there was to be a meeting at Rosebank," she said conversationally, "about the donation." Mrs. Jennings' hand tightened on her handbag. "Oh, I hadn't heard." "Inspector Dunning mentioned it," Miss Marple said gently. "He's very keen to understand what became of the money." "I imagine so," Mrs. Jennings replied, her voice steady. "Such matters are often misunderstood." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "especially when obligations are confused." Mrs. Jennings' smile froze for a fraction of a second, then resumed. "I really must be going." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "I wouldn't want to detain you." She watched Mrs. Jennings walk away, her steps measured, her back very straight. That evening Miss Marple paid a call on Inspector Dunning. She brought no notes, no accusations, only an observation. "You're expecting someone to come forward," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Am I?" "Yes," she said, "because someone believes they can still manage the situation." The inspector frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning that the person responsible thinks the danger lies in the past, not the present," Miss Marple said. "And that if the past can be controlled, the present will follow." He was silent for a moment. "You think the motive wasn't immediate?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "It was deferred, long-standing, carefully avoided." Inspector Dunning exhaled slowly. "And you think this person will act again?" "Not violently," Miss Marple said, "but deliberately." The following day provided confirmation. A letter arrived at the vicarage, addressed to Inspector Dunning, containing photocopies of old correspondence between Lionel Harcourt and a woman whose name had long since been changed. The letters spoke obliquely of money, of silence, of an arrangement that had benefited both parties at the time. The covering note claimed the letters had been found among Mr. Harcourt's effects, overlooked in the initial search. The inspector was unconvinced. The paper was too clean, the timing is too convenient. Miss Marple, when informed, nodded. "They were meant to explain," she said, "not to accuse." "Explain what?" "That the past was settled," Miss Marple replied, "that no further action was required." Inspector Dunning looked thoughtful. "Someone's trying to close the story." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "before it opens in the wrong direction." That afternoon Miss Marple set her plan in motion. She arranged a small gathering at her cottage, inviting Mrs. Bell, Mr. Pike, Mrs. Allen, and, as an afterthought, Mrs. Jennings. The invitation was framed as a simple tea, nothing more. In Bramblewick, such invitations were rarely declined. They sat together, cups in hand, polite conversation flowing easily at first. Miss Marple allowed it to drift, then gently steered it. "I've been thinking about how difficult it must be," she said, "to live for years knowing that one mistake could undo everything." Mrs. Bell nodded sympathetically. Mrs. Allen looked puzzled. Mr. Pike shifted in his chair. "Yes," Mrs. Jennings said smoothly, "the strain would be unbearable." Miss Marple smiled. Especially if the other party decided the arrangement no longer suited them. There it was. Mrs. Jennings' hand trembled just slightly, enough to rattle her teacup against its saucer. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Arrangements change, she said. People are entitled to protect themselves. Of course, Miss Marple agreed, but protection can take many forms. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. Mrs. Jennings rose abruptly. I think I should go. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. I think, she said softly, that would be wise. Mrs. Jennings left without another word. No one spoke for a moment. Well, Mrs. Bell said at last, that was awkward. Yes, Miss Marple said, truth often is. Later that evening, Inspector Dunning returned. Mrs. Jennings had requested a private meeting. She had arrived pale, composed, and ready, she said, to explain everything. Miss Marple, alone in her sitting room, poured herself a cup of tea she did not drink. She did not feel triumph, only a quiet sadness, because the final twist, she knew, was never that someone had committed murder. It was always that they believed they had no other choice. Inspector Dunning sent for Miss Marple the following morning, and when she arrived at the station, she found him unusually subdued. Papers were arranged neatly on his desk, though he did not look at them. Instead, he gestured for her to sit, and regarded her with the expression of a man who had reached the end of a long corridor, and discovered a door he had not expected. She told me everything, he said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. I thought she might. Mrs. Jennings' confession, delivered calmly and without theatrics, had been precise. Years earlier, before Bramblewick and before Rosebank, Lionel Harcourt had been involved in a financial scandal that would have ruined him entirely had it come to light. Mrs. Jennings, then newly married and in desperate need of money, had discovered the truth by accident. An arrangement had followed, silence in exchange for security. Over time, the money had come to feel less like payment and more like entitlement. When he returned to the village, Inspector Dunning said, she assumed the arrangement would continue, and when it did not, Miss Marple added, she felt betrayed. Harcourt had refused to pay again. He claimed the past was settled, that too much time had passed, that she could not possibly destroy him now without damaging herself. He had been wrong about one thing. Time did not dull resentment, it sharpened it. He asked her to meet him that afternoon, the inspector said. She confronted him about the donation. That was the argument you heard. Yes, Miss Marple said, it was never about generosity, it was leverage. Mrs. Jennings had followed him into the house moments later. Not in anger, she insisted, but in desperation. She intended to frighten him, to remind him that she still held his secret. But fear, Miss Marple knew, often belonged to the person who wielded it. Harcourt, already resolved, had refused again. He told her he was finished paying for old sins. The blow had come then, a heavy paperweight from the desk. One movement, no struggle, familiarity made it easy. Shock made it final. She waited, Inspector Dunning said. Just long enough to be sure. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. And then she left by the garden door. The open window was a convenience, not an escape. Mrs. Jennings had spent the days afterward doing what she did best, managing appearances. She encouraged suspicion where it was useful and calm where it was dangerous. When Peter Rowlands emerged as a suspect, she did nothing to correct the assumption. When doubt crept in, she attempted to steer the investigation back toward closure. Every action had been tidy, almost admirable. What gave her away, Inspector Dunning said, was trying to control the story. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Control is a habit. People rarely abandon it under pressure. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked through the village one last time before returning home. Bramblewick was already adjusting. People spoke of the tragedy with softened voices, careful now not to appear complicit in their earlier certainty. Peter Rowlands passed her near the green, his shoulders less hunched, his expression bewildered but relieved. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You needn't," Miss Marple replied. "Just be kind to yourself. Villages forget their mistakes more slowly than they admit." At Rosebank, officers were preparing the house for closure. Mrs. Allen stood by the gate, watching, her loyalty at last free to settle into something quieter. "I always thought he'd outrun it," she said, "whatever it was." Miss Marple nodded. "People often do, until they don't." The arrest was made without drama. Mrs. Jennings did not resist. She asked only that the matter be handled discreetly, for the sake of the village. The irony was not lost on anyone who heard it. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, the familiar comfort of routine restored. She reflected not on the cleverness of the solution, but on its sadness. Mrs. Jennings had not been a cruel woman. She had been frightened once, long ago, and had learned the wrong lesson from it. Power, once tasted, was difficult to relinquish. The village would recover, it always did. There would be talk, and then less talk, and eventually only a faint hesitation when the name Lionel Harcourt was mentioned. Bramblewick would return to its sameness, chastened but intact. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and gazed into the fire. Human nature, she reflected, was neither good nor evil. It was simply consistent. Given secrecy, it grew ambitious. Given fear, it became inventive. Given time, it revealed itself. The evening had ended wrong, as so many did when people mistook silence for safety. And somewhere beyond the quiet lanes and clipped hedges of the village, the truth would settle into memory, waiting patiently for the next time it was tempted to surface again. In the weeks that followed, Bramblewick resumed its familiar rhythms with an enthusiasm that bordered on determination. The hedges were trimmed, the shop windows refreshed, and the bells rang on Sunday with particular vigour, as though sound itself might smooth over memory. People spoke of the affair less and less, and when they did, it was with a careful choice of words that placed the event firmly in the past, where unpleasant things belonged. Mrs. Jennings' house stood empty now, its curtains drawn, its garden beginning to look neglected. No one volunteered to tend it. There were limits, after all, to forgiveness when comfort was at stake. The village preferred to remember her as she had been before the truth became unavoidable, capable, generous, and reassuringly decisive. She had been all of those things, even while committing murder was a contradiction. Bramblewick had no interest in examining. Peter Rowlands left for London shortly thereafter, accepting a position offered by a distant relative. His departure was framed as ambition fulfilled rather than escape, though Miss Marple suspected it was a little of both. On the day he left, he stopped by her cottage to say goodbye, his gratitude still awkward but sincere. "You saw it before anyone else did," he said. "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "I only listened longer. Rosebank House was sold by the end of the month." Mr. Pike handled the transaction with professional efficiency, though he confided to Miss Marple that the study would require a certain sensitivity if future occupants were to feel comfortable there. Miss Marple agreed. Some rooms remembered more than others. Mrs. Allen moved to live with her sister in the north, taking with her only a small trunk and the quiet dignity of someone who had witnessed too much. She wrote once to Miss Marple, thanking her for kindness and discretion, and adding that she hoped never again to work for a man who believed his past could be bargained with. Inspector Dunning returned to his other cases, though he wrote Miss Marple a short note of appreciation, carefully worded and professionally restrained. She smiled when she read it, then placed it neatly in a drawer with others like it. She did not collect such notes for pride, but as reminders that patience, when combined with attention, still had its uses. As for Bramblewick itself, the village adjusted its narrative with admirable speed. the story became one of tragedy and unfortunate secrets, rather than misjudgment or collective blindness. People reassured one another that such a thing could not happen again, though Miss Marple knew better. It could and it would, given the right conditions. Human nature did not change simply because it had been briefly exposed. One afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden with Mrs. Bell, who was once again planning a fete. The conversation drifted, as it inevitably did, toward the past. "It's all so strange to think of now," Mrs. Bell said. "One feels one never really knows people." Miss Marple snipped a dead rose and laid it aside. "Oh, I think we do," she said. "We just prefer not to see certain parts." Mrs. Bell frowned slightly, then smiled and changed the subject. That evening Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, the light fading gently through the lace curtains. She poured herself a cup of tea and settled into her chair, the familiar comfort of routine restoring itself without effort. Her knitting lay untouched beside her. She found she did not feel inclined to pick it up just yet. She thought of Mrs. Jennings, not with anger but with a distant sadness. Power, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely sought for its own sake at first. It began as protection, as reassurance against fear. Only later did it demand maintenance, and later still, justification. By then, the line between necessity and desire had blurred beyond recognition. She thought, too, of Lionel Harcourt, so confident in his arrangements, so certain that time had placed him beyond consequence. He had mistaken silence for absolution and familiarity for safety. It was an error many made, and few survived. Outside, the village lay quiet, lamps glowing softly behind curtains, voices muted, secrets carefully folded away. Miss Marple knew that beneath that calm, old resentments and quiet envies continued their patient work. They always did. She lifted her teacup and smiled faintly. The world, she reflected, was not divided into villains and innocents, but into those who paid attention and those who did not. Most tragedies belonged to the latter group. They assumed the past was finished, that appearances were reliable, that discomfort would resolve itself if politely ignored. Miss Marple set her cup down and reached for her knitting at last. The needles clicked softly, steadily, marking time. Bramblewick would remember this affair for a while longer, then gradually allow it to fade into anecdote, then into silence. But Miss Marple would remember it precisely as it was, a reminder that evil did not announce itself with drama, and justice rarely arrived with spectacle. Both crept in quietly, guided by habit and human weakness. The evening had ended wrong, but the morning, she knew, always followed. And as long as people continued to believe themselves unseen, there would always be someone like her, sitting quietly nearby, listening, noticing and waiting for the truth to reveal itself in its own small, inevitable way.